So this is our final segment at the butt end, as Chuck likes to say. At the butt
Yeah, and
end.
I say that all the time.
At the butt end of a whole night of filming. What better movie series to analyze as we have spent the whole evening imbibing in libations, and right now our total perspective of the world is kind of surreal. What better movie series to look at than the Phantasm movie series, the brainchild of Don Coscarelli? So here's my personal anecdote why Phantasm holds a really special place in my heart. So when I was living by myself, I was living in a shoebox apartment in Johnson City. This would have been right before turn of the century, like right 1998 to 1999 to 2000. I was living on my own, going to college. At the time, I still fancied myself a sci-fi writer. That didn't work out. Okay, because I just didn't have a good I didn't have a good grasp of science or math. And there are very few writers who can write good sci-fi that's based on human, Ray Bradbury's one. He could write what he called science fantasy, and it was about humans. I didn't have that ability. So I was coming to terms with the fact that all of my science fiction sounded like really bad Star Wars and Star Trek fanfic. And I was starting to branch. Somewhere in this period, I also read The Stand for the very first time. And I was like, holy cow. I mean, I had this very stereotypical vision of horror. And Stephen King was like, I don't know if anyone remembers the 1990s American Express Stephen King horror advertisement. Does anyone remember that? Where he's in front of this gothic castle, and he's like the epitome of horror. And I'm like, I don't know, I want to read that Stephen King guy. But here, I at this point, I read Stephen King of The Stand. I'm like, wow, this is really awesome. So I don't remember the specifics. I just remember at this point in my life, video stores were king. So, youngins, there was no Netflix. There was no Amazon Prime. No YouTube. There wasn't even a Redbox. We didn't even have DVDs. Laser discs were these really expensive. Yeah, sorry. It's late. Sorry for the Freudian slip. Laser discs were these.
That sounds like a terrible James Bond trap.
I'm sorry, I need a beer. Laser discs.
Video stores were the deal, and around here it was Video King.
Right. Laser discs and laser disc players were like for really a lot of money. We all
for
just
the rest
went.
of my life, anytime someone says Laserdisc, I am going to laugh, and I'm going to have to explain why.
Right. So we all went to video stores, and I've always said this that I have really great memories of just wandering through Video King, and here's a random movie. For example, do any of you guys know who Oliver Gruner is?
No.
Oliver Gruner is like a wannabe Jean-Claude Van Damme who had a really bad accent. He did a lot of martial arts movies, and I watched every single one of his movies. Why? Because of Video King. So I'm wandering through. So at some point we're gonna have you guys ever seen the Scanner series?
No, I wish I did though.
Or no, I'm sorry. Trancers. Have you guys ever seen Trancers?
No.
Anyway, moving on. So I'm wandering through Video King one day, and I see this movie called Phantasm. I'll give you a picture.
The haunted house section, right?
I don't even know what section it was in. All I know is it.
A haunted house section was really scary.
All I know is it wasn't in this.
Wild West section was not watched.
But say, yeah, it wasn't in the section that had the saloon doors, by the way, which I never went into. But anyway, Chuck has no idea what we're talking about right now. That's the best part.
I completely know what you're talking about.
That's good. That's good.
I know what you're talking about.
So, and I'll put a cover on here. So I saw this movie called Phantasm. I'm like, I'm not really into horror, but I guess I'll watch it. And I watched this movie, and yeah, it was in the 70s. It was a low budget, but back then, so this was 1999, 1998, so CGI really hadn't, this is still pre Matrix, pre special, super special effects. So I think we were more tolerant of low budget back then. But there was just something so. I mean, to me, the title of the movie was perfect. Phantasm. This movie was surreal. It was fantastical. It was, maybe it didn't make any logic sense, but it just like was, oh, what is this thing? So I'm like, well, look, there's Phantasm 2, there's Phantasm 3, there's Phantasm 4. I need to rent them all. So I rented them all back to back. And then Phantasm 4 stops, and I'm like, wait, there's no answers to this. And then for years and years and years, there was nothing. And of course, as I moved on, the Phantasm movies fell by the wayside. And it was only in the last year or two that I started revisiting them. And I remember rewatching Phantasm and thinking, okay, this movie is genius. Like, I know that when we hear the Halloween theme, we're like, oh, that's iconic. We hear the Jason theme, that's iconic. And then I thought to myself, man, when you start hearing the Phantasm theme, that should be just as iconic. I recently rewatched all the movies, and I am of the opinion that the Phantasm series has, every movie is very different. Like Tom said, I think Tom was the one that said, and I'll let you talk in a minute because I have like rambled on too long. Tom said that, yeah, I know, no. Tom has said that after 2, he's kind of like, bleh. I think all the Phantasm movies offer their own unique charm, but I think they are uniquely iconic in the horror genre just because of the tall man, because of those silver spheres that were all like, we know what that movie's from. And it just, it really speaks to Don Coscarelli and his passion for independent filmmaking, and his vision for horror. So, Tom, before I ramble on too long, let's kick it over to you. What are your thoughts and your memories of Phantasm? Your reactions, your response to it? Go right ahead. Take over, because I'm rambling on too much.
Yeah, no, not at all. All right, now, first of all, my first experience with Phantasm was actually Phantasm 2. Now, I know that caught a lot of crap for it, so, though, I'm going to be honest, I like Phantasm 2. Going back to Phantasm itself, and this is for those who have not seen it, believe it or not, they do exist. It deals with two brothers who, one, the older brother lost one of his close friends through the mechanizations of the tall man played by Angus Scrimm.
Boy!
Boy!
Yeah, I'm going to have to add a clip of that in there. Go ahead.
Anyways, it takes, as you mentioned before, it was a low-budget film, but they understood certain things that was scary, that did work. The biggest one was that's the funeral home. Oh, yes, as you can see right now, Kevin just made his own little sphere.
Oh!
The use of a funeral home was just petrifying. The two brothers, Mike and Jody, Mike being the younger one, they lost both their parents. He's afraid Jody's going to, ditch him. He's going to put him in an orphanage or something like that. That's not the case. And then also Reggie Bannister plays Jody's friend, Reggie, the ice cream man, who's become the iconic center of the Phantasm series.
He does. It's really weird how that happens, too.
Yes, and I know that when Phantasm 2 came out, they changed the actor for Mike, and then later on Phantasm 3, they went back to the original actor. But I liked Phantasm 2 because it showed people who just felt they were pushed too far and they were pushing back. Mike lost his brother Jody. Reggie lost his entire family. So they created these very strange weapons: a flamethrower, a four-barreled shotgun, which was absolutely awesome.
That's almost as iconic as Bruce Campbell's chainsaw hand.
Exactly. And the use of. Now, by the way, there's a lot of sci-fi in Phantasm, by the way, if you think about it. They were pushing the fact that Tallman may have been from a different planet who was taking the dead bodies of people or living, doesn't matter, turning their brains into the spheres used to attack others, crushing the bodies down into these little dwarves to serve on his home planet. The only problem is once you get into Phantasm 3, then the 4, then the 5, they just decided to throw any type of rhyme or reason out the window. In fact, let's be honest. So let's get to Phantasm number 5. The issue was between, it was all about Reggie, of course, but was it real or was, and this actually hit a personal note for me, Reggie being in a nursing home suffering from dementia.
Mm-hmm.
And, they even had Angus Scrimm act as his roommate.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he got the idea from. Coscarelli just near the end said, you know what, throwing it out there for you to make your own decision.
I'm going to come back to that. Yeah, keep going.
But there are a lot of good scare movements, everything from using, using humans as the Tallman's aides, the mortuary assistants, the grave diggers. I mean, that was just petrifying. Then to see Reggie in a chainsaw battle. I mean, there were a lot of good humor parts in it as well, especially with Reggie. One thing I kind of noticed, starting with Phantasm 2, it seemed to be, and I'm sorry if I offend anyone here, a giant cock block for Reggie. He's trying to hook up with all these women, and he constantly gets stopped for some reason or another.
We're going to talk about that. That was an intentional gag after a while. Yes, that was intentional.
You'll never get any again.
Yep.
But starting off with the first movie, which by the way I think really came out in the 1970s.
Yep, late 70s.
Phantasm 2 was definitely the mid 1980s.
Yep.
They just kept going on and on from there. I like how Phantasm 2 put some more effort into it, showing them chasing the tall man to the west, to Paragord, Oregon, and all these small towns and villages were just totally decimated by the tall man. I think it worked pretty well. Some people didn't like Mike's girlfriend in the second one, who was psychic or something like that. You know what? It came off well. It really showed some good effort. But as I said, when they finally got into 4 and 5, you're just thinking, oh my God, what in God's name is going on here?
So I've got specific comments for that. But Chuck, you recently saw Phantasm, the first one for you, the first time. What are your thoughts as a newbie coming to the Phantasm franchise?
Yes.
And are you likely to seek out the rest of them?
Yeah. So I will posit this as I am a newbie. So I'm watching this in the year 2020. So there's a big gap that's there. I'm not watching as someone who watches the glory days of the film. I'll be a bit more critical of it, but don't let that ruin anything. We talked in a different segment about how I was a big fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000, and yes, you can laugh and you can pick out some of the silly things that are in there, but you're not tearing down the film. Like,
right.
There's some cheesy elements for it, but at the end of the day, you appreciate what was done back then and what they could do. As I'm watching it, I cracked up on parts. The things that I'm watching it, I'm thinking, this is probably scary at one point, but it's making me laugh. And I looked that up. It's not on there right now. I could definitely see it done as the riff tracks or Mystery Science Theater 3000. The beats are all there. The pauses. There's some moments of some pretty rough acting, and there's some really rough editing in it. And that's what I noticed on it. It definitely plays into the tropes. The tropes are all there. You want to make sure you're the virgin so that you survive to the end. The cemeteries. And stuff like that. The first one has the story with the midgets and stuff like that. So a lot of old horror tropes are there. and it left me kind of amused as in terms of it almost felt kind of quaint. As in, this is another movie from another era. The scares I had heard was terrifying, but it doesn't last to the modern day. That said, again, don't take this in the wrong way. I can definitely see how it segmented itself, or not segmented itself. Cemented itself into horror canon. It does definitely have, I think, a place in people's minds from that time. It's one of the most 70s films I've ever seen. It feels very 70s-ish. The movie's about 70s teen boys dealing with 70s teen boy drama. So it feels critical, but what I would say is I think you can tell that they were dealing with a very limited budget, and it was from a different bygone era, and they did a really good job of playing out in that. So yes, it doesn't scare me. It feels like a movie that was low budget and outdated, but I can see why people who watched it back in the day loved it.
Yeah. So, a little bit, again, I've already talked about this in our book recommendations, but if you've read the Phantasm movies, or you've seen the first one, and you're interested in more background information, I would highly recommend Phantasm, the film companion, that's put out by Rue Morgue. And so, yeah, everything you guys are saying, I look back on the Phantasm movies, and you're right, Chuck. And I think a lot of horror fans will probably say the same thing. Our attraction to horror is not necessarily by what we find scary. Okay, that's the interesting thing about horror. For me, horror is not necessarily about what I find scary. I like the puzzle. Okay, this has a supernatural element. This has a human element. There's a mythic element. How are we figuring this out? Like, again, not to reference what we've already talked about, but no.
I spent the whole movie wondering when the Phantasm element comes in there, and I'm like, this is a sci-fi. The whole movie, I'm like,
sure.
I'm waiting for, like, okay, so when's the supernatural show up? This movie's called Phantasm.
Right.
And I get to the last 5 minutes, I'm like, there's not going to be a supernatural element. This is sci-fi.
Well, I would disagree with that, because the Phantasm, the idea of the Phantasm is this, like, I mean, he chops the tall man's finger off and it turns into like a weird buzzing fly. You know, you got these little, so to me, Phantasm is like the perfect middle ground between science fiction, fantasy, and horror, where it's, remember, the original genre that horror existed under was fantasy, not horror. Why? Because it was fantastical. So I know I'm probably splitting hairs here, but phantasm, fantastical, doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural. It just has to be.
Is that a word?
What's that?
Is fantastical a word?
Yes, it is a word, because
Fantastical.
because the horror genre did not exist as a genre unto itself until the late 70s, early 80s. Horror was always considered a subgenre of fantasy because it had an element of fantastical to it. But anyway,
fantastical is the human body's ability to actually recreate the opening scene of Phantasm. The first scene, I'm watching it, and there's the people hooking up in the cemetery, and I'm watching, I'm thinking, it's not physically possible to do that. Like if your legs are this way and you're vertical, the human spine can't do that.
Yeah. So anyway, we're talking about Phantasm. So you're right, Chuck. I think even when I discovered them, when I discovered them in Video King, I don't think I was necessarily very scared. The thing that drew me into Phantasm was, who the heck is the tall man? What does he want? Why is he squeezing people down into dwarfs? What is his agenda? Yeah, I think there's very few horror movies I've watched that have actually scared me. Maybe it's disturbed me, but really it's the, we've all got all these pieces. Where do they go? So talking about the first Phantasm movie, I think Don Coscarelli was 22 years old when he filmed this. Okay, he was 22 years old when he filmed this. His parents helped him with it. His mom helped him with the casting and the wardrobe. So this is like the holy grail that I will never be able to find because it's super expensive. So believe it or not, Don Coscarelli's mom wrote the novelization to Phantasm that is super, super limited edition. You cannot get a copy of it. You can find a copy of it online for free. You can, like in digitized form. A paperback version is like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Very limited edition. It actually kicked off his mom's mainstream novelist career. So that's like how homespun. They shot it on the weekends. Like the town that Mike and Jody live in was some random town. They didn't even get permission from the town itself. They just showed up and hoped that there weren't a lot of cars parked. And if there were cars parked, they went and knocked on people's doors and said, "Could you move your cars? We're filming a movie here." So it was the what's that? It was the ultimate.
I will say this. I can definitely sense the love and the passion that
yes.
That's great. I mean, the Tall Man was great.
Angus Scrim is amazing.
Reggie is great, and actually Reggie feels like a John Hughes character before there was John Hughes character.
Yes. Yeah.
Those elements are all great. I love hearing this passion because I can feel it.
Yep. So, Tom, you mentioned that you said that it feels like Reggie is being eternally cock-blocked. This became an intentional running joke that forever, Reggie would try to hook up with girls, and either the girls would be demons sent by the tall man, or the girls would get killed before he'd be able to hook up with him. That was total. They recognized that early on, and it was a total intentional thing. So let's talk about the tall man for a minute. Angus Scrim, and this is the power of Phantasm. This is what blows my mind. We said earlier tonight when we were talking about series, I was watching. Now, J.J. Abrams is a huge Phantasm fan. He was behind the remastered edition. There's an episode in Fringe season 1 where an FBI agent's like, "Oh yeah, Coscarelli and Scrim are on the case." I'm like, really? We're going to talk about a very short-lived TV series called Freakylings here pretty soon. In episode 3, Angus Scrim is one of the cameos. So this whole thing has become this cultural zeitgeist where there are cheap movies that don't make any sense and everyone loves them. Now, Tom, let's talk about Phantasm 2. And again, if you're really into Phantasm, hunt up this book. Great stuff. So here's the funny thing about Phantasm 2. Phantasm became this cult hit. Nobody was expecting it. Don Coscarelli certainly wasn't expecting it. Suddenly, Universal comes along and says, "Let's make Phantasm 2. Here's a freaking huge budget. But we don't like the guy who played Mike. You got to recast him. And also, none of this weird imagery. It needs to be an action movie." So they recast Mike. Guess who was one of the people who auditioned for Mike? He is, what's that? Today, he's one of the biggest players today. One of the guys who auditioned for Mike and didn't get the part for Phantasm 2 was Brad freaking Pitt. He didn't get it. Didn't get it. Coscarelli just thought he was a nice guy, but didn't think he fit. And that's also why you were saying that Phantasm 2 seems to have this plot where they're like, Reggie and Mike are, screw it, we're pushing back. It's because Universal told them, we need an action plot. We really need an action plot. And it was Universal's control that for the rest of the Phantasm movies, where Don Coscarelli's like, no, I didn't like that. I want to do my own thing. I don't want you interfering. So Chuck, if you ever get a chance to watch the rest of the Phantasm movies, so Phantasm movies not making any sense is kind of a Phantasm thing. It's like, if you love Phantasm, you're totally okay with the movies not making any sense. You're totally okay with Reggie being eternally cockblocked. I will tell you that if you watch all the way to Ravager, you will never figure out what the tall man's true agenda is. You are left with more questions than you are answers. And that was Don Coscarelli's, that's what he wanted the entire way. Talking about Ravager, Tom, you watched Ravager recently. So, unfortunately, if you get to Phantasm 5, which is Ravager, there are a couple downsides. Reggie, Mike, and Jody are really showing their age. There's such a gap between Phantasm 4 and Phantasm 5. It's a little obvious. The drop in budget is also really, really obvious. So unfortunately, the special effects take a hit. But I really like the plot of Ravager 4. This idea that there are, multiverses, and maybe in one universe, Reggie actually did all this stuff. Maybe in one universe, Reggie is just suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's. I thought that was kind of a neat little trick there. Side note, Coscarelli didn't go on and do much after Phantasm. He did direct Bubba Hotep, which if you have not seen Bubba Hotep, you have to go see Bubba Hotep. I mean, it's a great movie. Elvis fighting Egyptian soul suckers at a retirement home. I mean, can't say anything after that. So as we end the night, okay, Tom, do you have a final statement about Phantasm and its everlasting legacy in our hearts and minds?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth a watch if you're a horror fan. And again, just like we said, maybe not expect any type of resolution. Just enjoy the direction they're going. Okay, but sometimes, yes, you might think you're riding a psychotic horse towards a blazing barn. That happens.
Yep. Chuck, any final thoughts on your only viewing of Phantasm, and if you're likely to watch the rest of the movies?
I am. I think you're spot on saying it doesn't make sense, but I'm okay with that. I'll run with that. It feels like they said, like, this stuff's all scary. Let's put this in the movie. But it's funny. It's a movie where I can be really super critical about it, but it's just enjoyable.
Yep.
It feels like a fun homage to horror.
Yep.
I will say this though. I was looking up while we were talking. Yes, there is a book available for $995. A copy of Kate Coscarelli, but there's hope for you, Kevin. Someone found a used copy for $4 in a bookstore.
Really?
So you got to find one of those. There's 500 print copies out there. So.
Somebody has actually put it online, like on a HTML format. I would actually want to own it. So yeah, I just blows me away that this little. I think the initial run was only 500 copies.
500 copies.
This actually kicked off. Coscarelli's mom ends up having a mainstream writing career because of this. It's like, it blows my mind. I will end our segment with this. There have been rumors. It probably will never happen. There have been rumors of a reboot in the form of a Netflix series. I feel like in the right hands, with the right actors, in a serial format, that would be almost as good as Ash versus the Evil Dead. I feel like if you had a serial version of this, where Mike and Reggie are hunting the tall man across the country, maybe if we expanded the mythology a little bit. For example, have either of you seen yet From Dusk Till Dawn on Netflix?
Movie or
Movie.
No, the series, the Netflix series.
No, that's not a movie.
It's really, really good. They rebooted it as a series, and they expanded upon the mythology, and it's really excellent. Really, really excellent. I'm going to have to talk about it in a future episode. I would love, and it probably will never happen, because unfortunately, fortunately, unfortunately, whatever, Don Coscarelli has a really independent streak, so he may not ever let it be in somebody else's hands. But if this was rebooted in a Netflix series with somebody who loved the original movies and they were to expand the mythology in episodic adventure, I think it'd be awesome, and I'd love to see it. So that is our Phantasm retrospective. I can tell you that Phantasm is free, part of Amazon Prime. It's also on Tubi. Phantasm 3, 4, and 5 are also on Tubi. Phantasm 5, I believe, is free on Amazon Prime. Unfortunately, for some weird reason, probably because Universal was in charge of it, Phantasm 2 has to be rented on Amazon. So
I'll also add that the remastered is available on Shudder.
yes. So go, boy! I do have to say this, though, too.
Good Game Boy.
You've played a good Game Boy, and now it's time to die. I will say this. You got to give props for the original Phantasm. At the end of the movie, just say, like, screw it! We're not going to give you an ending. We're just going to have the tall man bursting through a window, and you don't know what's going to happen. Like, you got to give them credit for them just like, I'm not going to give you an ending. Screw it. Who cares if you figure out what happens? But that's our Phantasm retrospective for this edition, this final edition of the 6th cycle of Into the Abyss.